Welcome. This is Coach Schuman back for the Success for Life podcast. We've had a special guest on today. We're going to talk about something that's dear to my heart. One of the things that has been a fundamental theme throughout my life, which has been leadership. And we're going to talk to an expert, a pro on it, someone who's done a ton of stuff with respect to work with businesses. Obviously, I'm on the sports side, and he'll talk a little bit about that. But with respect to leadership, how to develop teams, how to develop leaders, strategic planning, and those kind of things. And we're going to dive deep into it. My guest today is Mike Watson. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks very much, Coach. Great to be here.
And it's like the theme says, Success for Life podcast. We're all about trying to bring opportunities to people, help them learn from the best, and you're one of the best in your field, so I'm excited to talk to you about it. Leadership is so important in today's day and age. It's always been important. Let me take a step back. It's always been important. It's always been the most probably important thing that that can be done successfully and well because the impact it has on so many people. And so it's great to have someone who really has an understanding of it, who teaches it, who works with people on it, who mentors and coaches businesses on it. And so I think it's critical. It's in everything we do in everyday life. It's one of those soft skills that for most of young people's lives, which is what a lot of I work with, coaches may teach it in sports. You might have some teachers here and there, but it's not part of the curriculum growing up, right? So if your parents are leaders, that's obviously a huge help. Hopefully your coaches are, and maybe a few teachers here and there, but it's not something that's easily gotten to as a young person. So talking with someone that's an expert in that field is tremendous. Mike, tell me a little bit about your background first before we dive into all that stuff. Tell me a little bit of your background. You're across the pond, I believe, right? So tell us a little bit about your background, where you come from, what you did in your life, and so everyone can hear about it.
Yeah, well, we're up north from you, Coach, and in British Columbia, Canada, raised in a small town, a little town called Trail, BC, that was known as the home of champions because of a lot of the great sporting people that came out of Trail. And so grew up in this environment where team sports and those activities are really what drove us. Went on to university and became a banker for a number of years. I had the misfortune of being kind of good at it, so I had the handcuffs on for a while, but finally escaped about 12 years into my career to form my consultancy, which is all about supporting organizations both in the sports world and in the business world to create and execute strategy. But what we found as we helped them create their strategy is that you've heard that vision is easy, strategy a little tougher, execution differentiates the winners from the losers. What we found is that the execution gap was in leadership. And so that's when the leadership component of our practice really started to emerge, because if you don't get the leadership right, don't even bother with the strategy.
Right. And that's the key. I mean, you could have the greatest strategy in the world, but if you have the people executing it don't either have the ability, the understanding, or the skill set, it really just it not only does it fall on deaf ears, but they don't have the ability to execute it. And so leadership is one of these things that's such a broad word, right? And it's like, that guy's a leader and this guy's a leader, and what there are different types of leaders. People, at least in the United States, we understand that George Washington was obviously a leader, and Abraham Lincoln is kind of generally thought upon as being a very good leader. In modern era, let's take sports, for example. Michael Jordan is thought of as being a good leader. And then from a coaching standpoint, a guy named Bill Belichick or Nick Saban, and those guys are generally thought of as being not just good leaders, but exceptional leaders. But there's leaders in business, and Lee Iacocca was generally considered a very good leader. For a long time, Jack Welch was considered a very good leader, but now kind of in modern times not looked and obviously everybody's a leader within their time. His principles back in that time now being applied, the GE method, which was once thought of as the gold standard method, applied today would not be thought of as the gold standard method, would probably be frowned upon a lot of times as far as execution wise to get the workers to do what they need to do. What makes somebody a great leader? What, in your opinion?
I love the where you've gone with that. Jack Welch was a leader in his time. He's the right leader for the era. Now we look at it and say his leadership tactics may not have worked, like they weren't quite right, but he had huge success in his era. I think the first thing, Coach, that you look at is defining leadership. What is leadership? And I love that you said it. It's really broad. You type in leadership on Google, get 1 billion responses. 1 billion responses. So we define leadership very simply as this, and it's a mindset. You must embrace this mindset. If I'm going to be a leader, I must enable people individually and collectively to be the best versions of themselves in pursuit of a common goal or in pursuit of something noble. My mindset on leadership is all about enabling others to be their best, because that differentiates from being the best on the ice or the best on the court to the one that enables others as a team to be the best. So the construct of team is really built in there. So I'm going to say leadership starts with the definition and the mindset that goes with it. Absolutely critical that it's selfless about the other people, enabling them to be their best. And then as times change, like we live in the most turbulent times in human history. So let's not think one style is going to work for the next 10 years because we're moving so quickly. Social change is just so rampant. Right now, we refer to society as awakening. And I don't have to take the bullshit anymore. I don't have to be told and just, you look at coaching. In the old days, the coach told you what to do. You did it. You showed up on time. You worked your ass off. And now you get these more humanistic coaches that are actually connecting more on a purpose level because society has changed. So they've had to adapt. And what we see a lot of leaders is they're caught in the old. This is how it used to be. Oh, kids nowadays. So I say, they say, oh, kids nowadays, they got to change. They don't want to do what we tell them to do. Well, I say, well, who's the leader? Who's got to change? Who's got to change? Who do you need to lead? What do they need to be their best? So it's all in that mindset.
I think there's two key things you hit on that are huge components for me. And to me, I hear first is adaptability. Okay. So there is no such thing. And I believe even back then, the best coaches, we're talking, sports is always an easy one because you could see wins and losses, right? That's why sports is kind of an easier thing. And especially at the highest level. But adaptability is a key component for a leader. And you hit on that, which in the old days, people said, you do this, this, and this, and you'll get the result you want. That's process. Process is a key part of it, right? But process without adaptability is not going to get to the thing that you said, which is getting the very best out of people. You can whatever someone's best is all you're going to be able to get, right? So your job as a leader is to figure out, in my opinion, what do they do well? How do they do these things well? And what is their capability, right? What is their capability? And then how can you get them there, right? So when you talk about how can you get them there, because they may not know that each person might require a different method. So my question is, because I think those key, and I'm pretty sure you agree just from hearing what you're saying. How do you find out what someone's capability is so you can then lead them, right? What do you, and I guess the other part, how do they want to be led, right? So their capability and figuring out how they want to be led, because they may say they want to be led a certain way, but once you get to know them, a really good leader will figure out this is how they really want to be led, right? So I'll let you run from there.
Yeah, well, how can you tell? Like in business, you hire an industrial psychologist and they give you a profile, an assessment. What's their IQ? What's their ability to manage conflict? What drives them? What motivates them? So, I mean, you can pay to have that done. In
Right,
sports,
right,
you have the combines. So you're
right.
getting a sense of the intrinsic ability, but it's then what can you draw them to? And it's about constantly pulling people outside of their comfort zone to allow them to be the best version of themselves. So this is where I come in. You know, I'm a business leader, super smart, but I don't have a lot of experiential skill. So the leader's job is to stretch them 5%, 5%, 5% continually to see what the upper bounds are. You know, and then there's also the thing of stress testing. So you create environments for these people that push them to the extreme. And you see that in sports, in practice in sports all the time. You see it in the best businesses where they create these pressure cooker environments to see how people will respond, but actually to give them the opportunity to learn and grow. The key to that is that constantly stretching people outside of their zone of comfort. There's some real good human psychology that goes into that, because comfort creates complacency, creates discontent. So you're constantly stretching them to find out where their top end is a really, really big part of identifying where the talent can go. And then how do you get the best out of them? I like that you've recognized not everyone is built the same. You got the introvert and the extrovert, to keep it very simplistic. You got the one that needs the spotlight on them and the one that can't stand the spotlight. I'll tell you a story. You're from Jersey, Lou Lamoriello, when he was coaching the Devils. So my really good buddy, Jordan Tutu, had his career rejuvenated by Lou Lamoriello. And he'll tell the story of how Lou would manage, because Lou knew that with the younger generation, you couldn't come in and fire and brimstone, but he needed to get a message out to them. And so he'd go in the dressing room and he'd scream bloody murder at Toots. Yeah, bah, 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 bah. But then he'd call him up after and he'd say, hey, Toots, thanks for being that guy. Because if I do that with the young guys, they'll turtle, they'll buckle. But I know you can take it. So he used him as the example because he was an old school player.
Right.
And he could take it. So, but then the message goes through Jordan to the other guys. The other guys are going to get in their handheld. But Lou's genius, eh?
And you know, so that's a brilliant thing that you just talked about, and you said it so casual, which is what I really like. That's how I know you really understand it. There are still those people that the fire and brimstone works with, right? And it's however they were raised, you know, or whatever their own personality. Sometimes how they're raised, sometimes their own personality, right? And there are those guys that you want to get on, and whatever that is in them, it just gets them to go to a different level. And then there are some guys, if you want to get them to go to the next level, like you have to put your arm around them. But I think what you talked about when he called them up after, to me, is the most important thing, right? They don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So whatever someone's personality is that gets the most, you know, whether it's yelling at them, whether it's putting your arm around them, in the end, they have to know that you genuinely care about them. That's where they're calling up after is such a big thing, right? I'm riding you because I know you can get there, but I'm going to call you up after when it's nice and quiet so you can understand that, listen, I think this is what we need from you. And I'm doing it because I love you.
You are spot on. And actually, so we did a lot of work with John Herdman, coach of the men's national team. He used to coach the women's team that won gold at the Olympics in soccer. And before he started coaching at that international level, he interviewed a bunch of former Olympians to say, what did you get from your coach? What 3 things did you get? And he narrowed it down to 3 things. They believed in me. They supported me. They loved me. Like, imagine that as a leader, your job is to love people. So I'm going to circle back when in our book, we talk about trust is the most important element in leadership. The mindset is my job is to enable you to be the best version of yourself. In order to do that, I got to build trust. And the single biggest driver of trust is I care about you. Doesn't matter the message I'm delivering to you, because you know I care about you as a person. So as a leader, my job is to care. I got to look at you and care about your future, care about your family. And that's so easy to forget. I was a leader, coach, and I didn't understand that part. And I was a smart guy. I go and I write the strategy, and I bring it to life. The board of directors actually applauds this strategy that I create. So imagine my 37-year-old ego, like I'm strutting around like King Tut. And then I go to implement, and it's tanking on every conceivable measurable. It is tanking. So I sit down with a colleague. I had one that I really trusted in the environment. I said to her, I said, what's going on? Like, why don't they get it? Why aren't they embracing this? Like, it just makes so much sense. She says, you know. I said, I don't know. Tell me. She said, they can't stand you because you don't trust them and you don't care about them. That's the image. That's what you convey. And it was the toughest message I'd ever heard. Honest to God, the toughest message, because I love people. I thought that's what leadership was all about the business. I didn't realize it was all about the people. So that allowed me then to look in the mirror, hold the mirror up high. Things aren't going right. Hold up the mirror. What do I need to do differently? And took a step back and actually started talking to people. Well, 15 years later, I'm reading a national newspaper, a full article in the business section. This enterprise that I had left 15 years earlier has just having these breakthrough results, unbelievable results. The people that were still there when I was there, they took it and they ran with it and they owned it. But my problem was I didn't show them that I cared about them. So critical in leadership. Like, you're spot on.
Right. And that's the thing, and then there are people that are hard to, you have to understand the people that have a hard time accepting that care, right? So that's also a very difficult thing in leadership. There are people, for whatever reason, and there's a lot of people that are like this, they view everything from skepticism. So you can be doing all those things. And this is the tough part of leadership. And this is a lot of it with teams and companies becomes a difficult thing, I think. No matter what you do as a leader, they, for some reason, will not trust you, or they won't even take that leap to trust. Now, they can have all the ability in the world, right? But if they don't, if you're the leader and that person isn't on board with you, for what reason? And usually it has, so there are things that you could do as a leader that are failures on your part. You talked about not showing you care, not investing time in them. But then there are also the other side of leadership is, what do we do when you feel like you're doing the things necessary and you either can't connect with that person on your company or team, or they don't want to get on board in the way that you want them to? Where do you figure out when that team member is worthwhile having on and then you got to just adapt certain things, or cut bait? Now, the guy that I see, I use this guy as an example, but it hasn't worked with everyone. But Bill Belichick has taken guys that are kind of like what you said Lou Lamoriello did with the player. I'm not a huge hockey guy, so
we're gonna get you there. We're gonna get you there.
But it's that's a good example of it, right? What Lou Lamoriello did, he rebirthed somebody. Bill Belichick's done it a few times. He did it with Randy Moss. He's done with a couple of guys. But then there are guys, for whatever reason, that it doesn't work with. Where are you at a point as a leader that you have to cut bait before the other guys who have followed you look at you like, hey, man, this guy's not going to get on board? Where does that come in?
Yeah, so let's start with the impact on the team first. My job is to enable them to be the best version of themselves individually and collectively. So let's look at the impact on the collective. I'm investing all this time in this guy who still use the old term, the cancer in the dressing room. And that works in business and in sports. You just can't get them there. That's cut bait. And maybe it's your style isn't getting through.
Right.
But if they're bringing the team down and you don't see a pathway to victory, it's time to cut bait. So that's in answer to your question, when do you go? It's when it's impacting the team in a negative way. There is no room for that person on a team. We have to be one team. And I'll get into that. There's a construct around that I'll get into. But that to get that trust, there are some people that have this shell, like childhood trauma, and it can be massive. And they create this shell around themselves to protect themselves. Like this buddy of mine that I told you about, NHL player, he grew up in an abusive household in the north of Canada, the first NUC in the history of the NHL, and he wasn't letting anyone in. He lost his brother to suicide with some of the social issues that plagued his people. And then he's got alcohol problems, and Coach McCrimmon, who's now down in Vegas, he couldn't break through. He couldn't break through. But 6 years after Coach McCrimmon had him, the message got through. The message finally got through. It took years. So, that's the human side. They might not be on your team anymore by the time you break through, but is it worth it? 100%. It's absolutely worth it. And I'll introduce, Coach, the construct. You may have heard it. The construct is Ubuntu. Phil Jackson talked about the best me for a better we. And who was the coach of the Celtics that really embraced it when they won their championship?
Well, the old days, Red Auerbach, or
no, more recently. Doc Rivers. Doc
Rivers. Okay.
Yeah. So Doc Rivers talked about Ubuntu, and the concept of Ubuntu is "I am because we are." And it comes from a Zulu phrase, which the literal translation is a person through other people. And when you create that environment of a person as a person through other people, that's the way to break through. Like it really works. I had a couple of colleagues and they were bitching at each other, mad as hell at each other. And they, their chests are puffed out and they don't want to speak to each other anymore. And the more senior of the two of them, we're doing our one-on-one session. He says, he's a pain in the ass and blah, blah, blah. So I walked up to the whiteboard and I wrote the word Ubuntu. And I said, because we've used the term in our office before. I said, think about it, and I'll be back in 5 minutes. I went and had a coffee, because it's not my problem. It's his problem. So I went and had a coffee, and I came back, and he says, message received, Coach. And that was it. Because your job as a leader is to help everyone be the best version of themselves. And this ego trip that you're on right now isn't helping us. And so then you come back to the team. If somebody can't live by Ubuntu, then they don't fit on the team. But we want to give them every chance, because if they're at their best, the team will succeed. We watch players who have the rejuvenation of their careers, and it's, have they really changed? Have they really changed? Because that's easier said than done.
Right.
One coach, great NHL coach to me, says when they're in their early 20s, Mike, he says it's just immaturity and growth. By the time they're in their late 20s, it's character flaws. And so they've been given these opportunities along the way. Have they embraced it? And if they still haven't by the time they're in their late 20s, I'm using sports as the environment there. In business, you probably take a little longer because there's broader based learnings that have to take place. But it's at some point you recognize it as a character flaw that you can't change.
Right.
So then there's another piece that builds in. It's, if you don't see the motivation the willingness to change with the motivation, you work as a coach to say that, like, this has to change. And if you don't see in your colleague at work or in the athlete the willingness to do things differently, and then a motivation that's bigger than self to do things differently, likelihood of success is zero.
Right.
Because when the going gets tough, they're going right back to the way they were.
That's really interesting. And in this speed that everything is going on now, like, so you need people to perform more quickly than you did in the past, right? Better. You need to perform better, more quickly. And I think that places a lot on leaders. And obviously it depends on the type of organization you're in. But how does a leader get results quickly when one of the kind of hallmarks of leadership is building for time, right? Ultimately, you may be not good in the beginning, your team, but they become better from your leading and coaching, and that could be in business as well, right? Just an entrepreneur starts a company, he only has a few bucks behind him. As he builds his team over time, they become more and more successful, right? You could look at Amazon as the example of that, right? Him and his wife, of course, his wife ended up, he goes in a different direction on that. But him and his wife's a support base. He's basically written Amazon on the wall over there and starting delivering some books. And then he builds it up over time, right? They become a better and better organization over time. And you see that over and over again, that you need to be able to do things more rapidly. How do you get the most out of people more quickly? I guess let's start with that question first. How do you get the most out of people more quickly than maybe they would have wanted to go in the past? Because if you don't start to push the envelope with them in business, is much more in business than it is in sports. But they're going to move on to a different company, right? If you don't identify that skill set, you don't start accelerating them. 23-year-olds today do not have the same level of patience. Nothing to do with ability. It's just the world they live in moving faster. So they're trying to figure out and expect things faster. How do you adapt with that?
Yeah, well, so you run the risk of your employees moving on because they're not winning. We all want to win, hey?
Right.
You got to create this winning culture. We want to win, so let's define what winning is. And let's remember, there's also the investors. If you're not making money, I got some patience. I'll put this money in, but at some point, I have every expectation of a return, and no one should have a problem with that I expect a return. So then the magic comes in, how do you do that? So let's first define what winning is early. So is winning profitability in year one? Maybe it's not. Maybe winning in year one is some milestones and we celebrate those milestones. Maybe it's profitability. But let's be really clear what great looks like in this year, which is a stretch for all of us, but it is achievable. And let's make sure that's what we're celebrating. Because if we're saying, yeah, we're going to be profitable, but that's 2-3 years out based on where we're at today, or we're going to hit an inflection point and skyrocket. If we're not realistic in the timeline, people get frustrated, investors get frustrated, and the employees get frustrated. So this is about creating a common vision or mission or purpose. You're like, what is it that we're in pursuit of? What makes this a great year, and what is the long-term pursuit? How does what we do this year serve to the long term? And let's align our people and give them ownership of it. You know, this old term buy-in, they need to buy in, it's a terrible term. Because that means I'm selling you something. I'm selling you a bill of goods. No, they got to own it. And so when we talk about why are you here, coach? Why did you join our team? How does it fit to where you want to go? What do we need to get right this year to have it work for you and your growth and us in our growth? That's back to Ubuntu. And we got to link those two things and set those goals. And then we work our asses off to get there. And we don't tolerate less than hard work because you've said you want it. So now I care about you and you said you want it. So may I have permission, coach, to push you? And maybe some will say yes, whatever they're going to say. But now that we're aligned and you have said this is good for me as well as it's good for the company, we've created license to push for hard work, to set that bar high. So aligning around mission, really, really critical. And that mission must be realistic, but it must be aspirational.
That's mind blowing there. How? Oh, you got like echo here for a second. Can you hear me good?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, I don't know why I have an echo. Do you have an echo on your end?
I do not.
talk from this side here. There's some reason we're getting an echo. So with respect to leadership, and one of the things I think is so critical is this idea that there are a lot of bad leaders that end up getting in positions of leadership. And how is that such a thing? So I look at government, for example, a lot of time. You see people in government that have people in place that you have to deal with, and I have to deal with it in my business a lot of times, that don't make decisions effectively and don't feel like they are incented to make decisions effectively and are in positions of leadership where they have to make decisions. Why is that an issue in organizations? One of the big issues that we have why leadership is so great leadership has become so important and so recognized is because there's so much bad leadership. What do you say on that?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'm going to say is let's not use politics as a breeding ground for great leaders. Because look at what they do. They are in pursuit of power and popularity. And neither one of those are healthy leadership. Back to the construct of Ubuntu, for the better we. There are some very rare leaders in politics that you will find who are really driven on what's best for society. But leadership will never be a popularity contest. If you think it's a popularity contest, you're not going to be the best leader you can possibly be. Because you got to be unpopular sometimes. To be caring, to care about someone, sometimes there's tough messages. So let's not use politics as the example. How do leaders get into these spots? And I'll use the corporate example in sales. The best salesperson wins because we've created this hierarchical structure that to get the bigger paycheck, you got to get the next promotion. And so the best salesperson becomes the manager of people. Well, that person may not want that. That person may have no skills in that. And you look at the greatest players in sports, they don't often make the best coaches. I mean, interestingly, in hockey, sometimes the enforcers, the guys that drop the gloves for the good of their team, have gone on to be the best coaches.
Interesting.
Yeah. So let's be careful who we put into these roles and why we put them into the roles that they're in. Like, for gosh sakes, why take your best salesperson and put her into the role of sales manager if she doesn't like leading people? Some just aren't equipped and they don't want it. So who we choose is really, really important. And then give them the opportunity to develop. So why are there so many poor leaders? Because we haven't emphasized as the group that promotes what leadership really is. It comes all the way back to your first question. What is leadership? Enabling people individually and collectively to be the best version of themselves in pursuit of a noble goal. And if we think leadership is about widgets, then we're going to promote the wrong people.
Yeah. And that's a key point. Your sales example is an example that I think is the key. There is too many examples of people seeing a higher performer in one area and mistaking them as a leader in another area. And then there's a lot of examples where people see someone who doesn't do well, let's say in sales, and dismisses their abilities in other areas, maybe leadership or operational.
Yeah.
So are there tests that can be done to figure these things out?
Yeah, there are some great tests. And I talked earlier about the Industrial Psychologist, and there's a whole industry around psychometric testing and for leadership. And the leadership competencies. We've actually created, and we've just launched it this month. And I didn't know you were going to give me a commercial opportunity, Coach, but I'll take it. I'll dive right in because I'm an we've created an assessment tool. We had a bunch of team of industrial psychologists that looked at what we call out as the attributes or habits. We use habits because they're repeated, of great leaders. And it enables people to self-assess on their skill as a leader in today's times. Now, what we test for today may not be what's going to work 10 years from now. But in today's turbulent times, where leadership is about building trust, and that's that trust with care. It's about humility, which is I can't succeed unless you succeed. So I diminish my role to elevate your role, because as a leader, I need you to succeed. It's about inquisitiveness, the ability to ask great questions for two reasons. When I ask a question of you that's a serious question, what do you think we should do? Well, coach, what's going through your mind is you're now engaged. You're given an opportunity to own this problem. So part of me asking you is giving you a sense of ownership. The other part is I make a better decision. I may disagree with you, but I've got another data point from which to draw from. So inquisitiveness is a critical issue for leadership. And then there's the governing, the how I govern myself. Optimism in today's turbulent times, war in the Ukraine. We've got the health crisis going on. We've got interest rates going up. We have to have this optimism that if we work hard and do the right things and put in the work, great results will come. The next attribute is discipline. Discipline is self-discipline. I sleep well at night, like I go to bed early, I get up early, I eat well, I don't drink too much, I get my exercise. It's absolutely critical. To be the best version of yourself as a leader, you need to be self-disciplined. And then the last one is courage, the courage to say what needs to be said. So there are tools of that nature. They're countless. Just Google leadership assessments and they will come up. But if you really want to go deep, you go to a team of industrial psychologists, and there's one in every city. And you say, I'd like to get a leadership assessment done. We don't hire anyone without putting them through a leadership assessment. Companies, great success stories that you look at. That's a standard part of their promotion practices.
Yeah, leadership assessment is not something that I think a lot of companies do on a regular basis, and it's a huge mistake. They'll do psychological assessments. They'll do I don't know, the Briggs-Meyer assessment. What do you want to do with your life? On the Briggs-Meyer assessment, I don't know, when I was what I wanted to do as a youngster completely changed, and I think those things are failures to be able to understand what people can and can't do. And I think the biggest mistake, and then I'll let you talk about it, and I'm muting you when you're not talking, just because for some reason I'm getting feedback. I don't know why that is, but when people interview, I think interviewing, the way it's done in most places, not all, there are places I'm sure that do great interviews, but you interview with one person, I'll bring in then a committee of 3 or 4 people who probably half of them aren't good leaders anyway, and they're going to interview you. And then we're going to make an assessment on who you can hire basically off of whatever your load of BS that you're filling me up with, so I can give you my load of BS of what our company's about, and nobody's getting any real answers. Then they're working, and then 30 days later, they're like, oh, he's not who I thought that person was in the interview. Well, that's not much of a process, and I see it over and over again, and then they wonder why there's so many failures. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Oh, the process of hiring. Let's get into these panel interviews. I hate them because what you're setting someone up for is a popularity contest. How am I going to have them like me? That's not a test of your skill and ability. That's a popularity contest. How do you really assess someone's ability? What have you done in the past? Tell me about the results of your teammates. So you ask somebody in an interview, I don't need a panel. I just want to sit down with you and say, that last team that you were on, tell me about the results of your teammates. Watching how you respond to that is going to tell me all about you as a leader. Because were you selfish? Well, they all worked hard and I got these results. Or are you able to tell the story of how you worked with them to enable them to get better results, even though we were all at the same level? And so the star performer, the absolute star, may not have been the one helping others. And that comes out if you ask the right questions. But don't set it up as a popularity contest. Set it up for real dialogue to get below the surface. Tell me where you grew up. I start every interview by asking them to give me a retrospective because I'm curious. I want to learn about you. Tell me about where you grew up. Tell me about your family. Tell me about what it was like being a kid in Arkansas. Tell me what you love to do. What did you love about your last job? What would they say about you? Like, get real with people and then recognize that we are heavily influenced with unconscious bias as individuals, massively influenced by unconscious bias. So then take what you've learned and use it as a hypothesis. I think Coach Schuman is going to be a great guy. But then do the next piece, which is some sort of a profile. Don't use Myers-Briggs. It's the most statistically insignificant tool that exists. Okay, the psychologists will tell you, oh my God, don't use Myers-Briggs. Coupled with others, it can be great. I hope that's not slander. I don't want to get in trouble. It's not one that I'd be a fan of. But find an assessment that you're comfortable with, which validates your findings. Don't trust your instincts because recognize the unconscious bias, and or bring another colleague to say, hey, I met with this person and I quite like what I'm hearing. I'd like you to meet with them, but I don't want to color your opinions. You know what we're after. Could you meet with Coach Schuman and tell me what you think? But you're doing it with real purpose. You're not putting you in a room to sit across a panel to win a popularity contest.
Amazing points there. And there's a couple things I want to break down on, and I know I've taken a lot of your time, but I appreciate it. I've been on things, and as a person who's been a football coach for 20 years, I've seen all these interviews, and especially obviously these are organizations, schools. Some have good leaders, some don't. Obviously, I've run my own company, so I've had failures and successes of my own. I've learned from my own interviewing of other people where I've gone wrong, what I've done well. What my own flaws were on those things. And here's what I find is so interesting. When you tell people exactly what you've done and when people have asked you, which I think is a great question, what failed at this place, and you explain to them. And one of the things I've always said, so years ago, I built a football program that was a very successful program. My opinion was it was poor leadership at the top that got it to that point. There was one very good leader in the middle there who ended up hiring me, and we ended up having a lot of success because him and one other person acted as a shield for a long time. But in the end, I always said, the overall organizational leadership ended up, even though we've been to the state championships and all these things, their desire to have our group succeed long term was never there, in my opinion, and ultimately, which led to my departure. I bring this up every time I've ever interviewed in football after that, and I bring up and I say, well, the thing that I want to know is when we become very successful, is the school ready for a highly successful football program with now that being the number one program in the school? And they are shocked when you answer it that way. But I've definitely lost jobs because of it, because I realize when I don't get that job, and if I was the best candidate, in that case, sometimes there are better candidates than you, and that's what it is. But when you're probably the best candidate, I know right away that it's because when they assess themselves, they're not ready for what that brings. Okay. And what does it bring? Football in America is a really popular sport, and everything that comes around that, there is a lot more management that ends up in their mind having to happen when you become wildly successful, because the football coach asks for more things. The families, there's a lot of money that comes into the program because you get more support, so on and so on and so forth, which ultimately means they have to manage things that go outside of the school responsibilities, which is why I've always said that the European model, and maybe Canada's similar, I'm not sure, but the European model of like where school is school and then club is club is kind of always been an interesting thing to me, because schools have sports in America, and there becomes and either we're committed to success in sports or we're not, right? Whether they say it or they're not, it really is. We're committed or we're not to it. We're a academic school and we don't care about sports, or sports is a large part of who we are academically. And it's because of the management and leadership part that goes into it at the what you guys probably would call I don't know, secondary. I don't high school is like the secondary level. What do you think about that? I think it's an interesting thing, and I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Okay, the first thing I want to say is integrating sports in school is critically important, and we don't do nearly enough of it in Canada. And I envy the way you do that in the US, where high school kids are convening in the stadium to watch the school football team play on a Friday night. That creates a sense of community. It gives them something to aspire to, something to rally behind, and it enables kids to be the best version of themselves. And I'd use the same argument for theater and for the arts. Okay, it's not unique to sports, because if we recognize education as being the place where we are grooming children to become adults, the best versions of themselves, then that's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic. Okay, it's life. And you learn so many lessons from sports. And I was one of the lucky ones. I did sports and music growing up. I learned a huge amount playing in the band, singing in the choir, playing on the hockey team, playing on the soccer team. That is the tapestry that allowed me to be where I am today. So first thing I want to call out is what you're doing with sports in schools. Gosh, I hope your nation holds on to that.
That's awesome to hear. That's awesome to hear.
Second piece is now you get into, are we ready to succeed? Okay. So we put this thing out there and there's this conservatism, but dare to dream. And then what? What happens when we're on top? And I'll tell you the truth. Most people struggle with that. They're cogs in a wheel. And so if you're a dreamer, dream big. There are people who aren't going to buy into that. So you know what the truth is? It's not a good fit for you because you're a dreamer. So just accept the interview process. You didn't land there. Be thankful. Thank God for unanswered prayers. Garth Brooks, this is so important. They're not ready to be successful at that highest level. And maybe they're an academic institution. Maybe they don't get it. Maybe they just can't think that way. But you're not a good fit for them. Go where people dream big. Because if you dream big, join dreamers. But make sure the dreamers have the infrastructure, the discipline to do the little things to get there. So you start with the dream. That's way up here, eh? Get the dream. Then let's go right back to what do we need to do tomorrow, today, in this minute, in order to achieve the dream. And that's the discipline, tactical approach. I was chatting with a former pro athlete the other day, and he talked about habits with discipline. He says, how do you get great habits with discipline? That's not answering your question, but it's that you get habits with discipline enables greatness, and then be ready for it. Prepare for it. So we're getting better and better. We're soon going to be great. And that's going to have different demands on us. So our strategy is going to have to shift as we get to this next level. But if you can't be surrounded by people who dream, get the hell out.
That is so. I think every person that is in leadership should understand those things. And that's, I guess, a self-assessment, right? Before you going into a situation, or maybe even when you're there, right? You realize, okay, this may be for me as far as your interview process, or they're not on the same level that I am, or some people, and I look at it from it's a really, really interesting thing that you said there, and I'm just trying to unpack it. When you go into an organization, you're at different stages in your career, right? So you can legitimately go in at the same stage as one place. So they may say, yes, our dream is to be the best at X, but they really haven't, it's more of a thought than a dream, right? And you think, okay, you can do something there, but you're early enough in your career that you don't know much about anything, right? So now your next thing is you get to a certain level. They're still, maybe they moved a little bit, but they're here, right? So now you have to think, can they get there where I'm now at? Because I've kind of gone maybe past them. Or do I need to move where they're already at this level or higher where I could continue to grow? So I think what you said there is so important is we're all at different stages in our career at different points, right? Whether it's owning a business, whether it's our own leadership skills, and understanding where we're at, where we fit at that moment, at the same time that we're aspiring to go to a different level, and then finding places, persons, or things that meet that level and continue for us to find either new places. Some of us are lucky enough to find it in one place. Great, but being able to assess that. Do you have anything for self-assessment?
Well, the self-assessment we have on leadership, but if the place you're at isn't going to give you the ability to grow, to optimize the God-given gifts that you have, then you should leave. Okay? Don't blame anyone. Just leave. Own it. Own it. And you've risen to this level, as you say. I'm here now, and the organization has stayed flat, and I'm not growing any further. It's time to leave. There's a wonderful example in First Nations history on the west coast of Canada. Squamish Nations, actually be the west coast of North America. And this is the land of plenty. They didn't have the Iroquois and the Huron fighting battles. They were the land of plenty with safety, shelter, food. They had it all. And every second or third generation, because they had everything set up, this is before colonialization, the elders of the tribe would come to them and say, it's time for us to leave. We're going to pack up our belongings and we're going to leave. You think about that. They had everything. Why would they leave? Why would they pack up and go? The elders knew that comfort bred complacency, and complacency bred discontent. And they needed to be industrious in pursuit of something grand. So they would pack everyone up and they would start again, just for the purpose of packing everyone up to start again. We need to embrace this in our lives, the constant pursuit of growth, because happiness only comes when we're growing. Happiness isn't sitting on a beach. That's recovery that allows us to work hard, but it isn't happiness. Happiness comes when we're working hard at something we're good at, that has purpose and meaning, with people who trust us, that we trust, when we're constantly being stretched outside of our comfort zone. You look back at the happiest times in your life, they will be when those conditions held. Working hard at something you're good at, that had purpose and meaning, with people you trusted, where you're being stretched outside of your comfort zone. That's what it's about. And when you no longer can say those things, that you're working hard at something you're good at with people you trust and you're being stretched, it's time to move on.
Very amazing stuff. Amazing. I always think of, I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Abraham Lincoln when he changed generals, but I read a whole thing about, read a whole thing on Ulysses Grant and read a whole thing on Abraham Lincoln. And his first general was this guy who was very accomplished, McClellan. Incredibly accomplished general, all kinds of success. And he, everyone said, this is who you should have as your general. And he put in place as his leader. And he was a wild failure. He wouldn't engage the South. He wouldn't ready his troops to fight. He wouldn't, and they were getting beat at every turn. And he turned to a guy, for all intents and purposes, Whereas General Lee was number one in his class, was the administrator of West Point, was Ulysses Grant was at the bottom of his class, was known as a guy who had potential, but he was kind of a drunkard a little bit, drank a little bit too much, and wasn't the natural choice. But he understood the objective, and he was willing to get the most out of his people, as you say, and was humble enough as a leader to take the direction from another person who was also obviously the president of the country, was a leader, right? And took action and became, you talk about underdog stories. He's a great underdog story because he ended up becoming the person who was the de facto greatest general of his time, which was Lee. And now he had obviously the ability to have more resources and stuff like that, but he was the most unlikely person to lead the North as a leader. And somehow Abraham Lincoln had the ability to see his initial mistake, and then have the courage to choose an unlikely leader. I that's why when people say who are the best leaders of all time, it's always someone that I put in there. And there's obviously many other things like freeing the slaves and there's a million things that he did that were amazing. But that was one of his strokes of leadership that was glaring, right? The willingness to listen to Ulysses Grant, the willingness to listen to a former slave and Frederick Douglass, the willingness to have a group of people in his cabinet that were not even of his political party in a lot of cases and had differing views, and to be able to get the most out of those people. It's mind-blowing. And I think that that's an example, as you said, as someone whose expectations for what things could be were at such a level that everybody around him raised their level to get to that point. I don't know what your thoughts are.
You got to let me jump in. You have opened Pandora's box with that one. I got three constructs that I want to raise with you. The first is societal's pursuit of perfection today. I think it's a real challenge in our society today. The second is leadership through failure. And the third is a life lesson that I was taught along the way. You talk about the Ulysses Grant versus I think Lee was the other general, and one had the resume and one didn't. We're more and more resume focused now. And with the social media that's out there, and somebody says the wrong thing somewhere along the way, they're disqualified. Well, we forget people learn through their mistakes. And yet we're so fixated on perfection that we're looking at resumes that appear perfect. But I got to ask the question, what mistakes have they made to learn from? There's an adage I raised our children to, which is wisdom doesn't grow in our good days. Okay? Wisdom grows when we fail. Yeah, you have your best day. What did you learn from today? I like winning. Okay, lesson learned. But what did you learn when you failed? If I'd done this differently or that differently. This societal pursuit of perfection actually drives mediocrity because I can't fail. So that to me is a huge, huge takeaway. I look for people that have failed. I want them to tell me about their failures and what they learned from them and where they want to go with it. Don't make the same mistake, but you got to fail. Find the crash line. Just don't cross it, and cross it as seldom as you can. The second piece is leadership in troubled times. And one of the great, the case study, you go to Harvard University, they'll talk a leadership case study. There's a guy named Shackleton, who was an explorer of the Antarctic. And he's the famous explorer of the Antarctic that everyone talks about as the example of leadership. He never made it. He was the one that never made it. Yet he's described as the great leader because he was a leader who had an indomitable spirit, and he got all his people home alive. So he cared about his people beyond the goal. His people were more important than the destination. And it's just such a powerful piece with this Shackleton. And that's the leader that's remembered and written about today, not the guys that made it. Hey, isn't that fascinating?
That is fascinating. I think I've actually read his story. That's where
you will have seen it.
The boat went down and they or something, and they thought they were stranded there, and they somehow all came home alive. No one.
Yeah, it's the most amazing story. They were on a boat without navigation equipment, and they traveled hundreds of miles using only the stars, and they came with pinpoint accuracy to get home. The stories are there's some videos done about it. Shackleton, it's just an amazing story of leadership and what he's remembered for. And I'm going to come back to the third piece that you talked about in who you hire and who you promote. You know, is it the general with the great resume or the one that's made the mistake? And you know, I was born to a pretty good environment, a really good environment. Like I didn't have to go through a lot of the challenges that many go through. My father was a very successful engineer, and he ran a global. He didn't own it; he was an employee in a global company, a very senior level. And I said to him, "How do you hire engineers?" He said, "Well, he says I look for the one with the absolute best grades, and I hire them to go into our research department, and there they remain for their careers. And then I go to the ones with average grades that are involved in all the social activities, because they will become our leaders." And so it's not the smartest, it's the most adaptable that thrive. And the piece that we look for is grit. You know, we've known in sports, you've known about grit forever. The one that just gets up, dusts off, moves on, doesn't have the hang your head body language, oh poor me body language, gets up, dusts up, says, put me back in, coach. You know, the Rudy in that great movie.
Right.
Just brush off, and I'm gonna go at it again. Through COVID, the American Psychology Association has actually called out that one of the most significant attributes for resilience, the ability to withstand a blow and keep going, is grit. Optimism is another, inquisitive is another, but they're talking about grit. So when we interview people, I want to see the grittiness. I don't need to see an Ivy League education and the top marks. I want to see that you came from here and you made it to there, because that's grit. Show me that. Show me that you're going to work the hardest to get to what you're capable of achieving. The indomitable spirit. How do you measure when we think about leaders of the eras and who were great leaders? Many would talk about Winston Churchill as a leader for the times, Abe Lincoln. But what did they have? They had an indomitable spirit. They would not give up. Churchill's famous speech, never give up. Never give up. That was a convocation address he did at a university. He said 6 words and he sat down, and the standing ovation lasted 15 minutes. But that's the grit. Amazing. And I'll tell you, when we look for grit as leaders, we show grit. We don't give up. We set great goals, and we work with our teams to give them ownership of the goals. And then we take the blows and we own our mistakes. Yeah, I screwed that one up. Oh man, that sucked. And then we move on. Man, now you're talking about real leadership.
Yes, that's fantastic. I mean, I've learned so much on this podcast today about not just about leadership, but what it takes, and not just the skill sets, but the personality of it, and the ability to get people to do their best. It's one of the things I've always said. Like my son, who's going to be 7, and he plays all these sports. He's a very good athlete, and he's luckily he's got good genetics in him from that standpoint, and he does well at things. And his first reaction, and these things I believe a lot of it can be taught. You have to have certain innate skills. Everybody has certain genetic, but a lot of it can be taught. And his first thing is always, did I win? Did I not win? And I always say, did you give your best? Did you give your best? Yes, I did. I said, that's the most important thing. You're going to, If you're running track, eventually you're going to run into somebody faster. If you're playing football, you could be the greatest football player for the longest time. Eventually, you're going to run to possibly somebody better. But the key is, did you give your best? If you gave your best, everyone around you and yourself, for yourself, you will know that you have the ability to give the best that you can. And then that you can take in everything you're doing, right? And that's where sports obviously is it is not life, but it's a metaphor for life, right? Things you
Absolutely.
learn are metaphors for life. So the metaphor is, did you give your best? Well, when you go in an office and you're working every day, what is your best is not as clearly defined as it is in a race. Now if you're a salesperson, it is, but if you're there and you're given like 10 tasks and you complete those tasks, you have to really think about what you're doing to be your best. So it is a metaphor because what you talked about is continuously pushing the envelope a little bit beyond your comfort level gives you the opportunity to keep doing your best. And ultimately that's what all we can do is what our best is. And it's our job to figure out what that is, right? And great leaders help us figure that out so we can then hopefully get as close to that as possible. When you say to your kid, did you do your best? And there's a feeling when they say to you, yes, I gave my best. At that moment, they realize, oh, that's what it's about. Now they forget very quickly at 6 years old because you got to remind them. But ultimately, if you remind them enough as they go through failures, okay, they'll realize I didn't give my best in this situation. Why didn't you give your best? What is the reason you decided not to give your best? You didn't like what you were doing. Okay, let's figure out what that is. You'd like to be doing this. Okay, let's figure out if that's viable, right? But when you have moments of recognizing when you did your best, you then can assess it. And then that's what the leader's job is, to help you find that within you.
And you know what you just did? You talked about having your 7-year-old own it at 7. Okay. Did you do your best? But you actually said, what is your best? Define your best. Our kids, we get our greatest sources of inspiration from them. And I love how you finish our podcast talking about your kid. And my daughter's a lot older. She's 27. I got a son, 29, and a daughter, 27. And our daughter, when she's got her father's athletic capabilities. Okay, coach. So we ain't a Coach Schuman here. Okay. Like I was tenacious, but I wasn't gifted with a lot of athleticism, nor was my daughter. But she had tenaciousness. And she was in grade 10. I think that's a junior with 2 more years.
Sophomore, yeah.
Sophomore. But she got 2 more years of high school left. So now she plays basketball, and she played on the sophomore team, but she wanted to go to the next year. But now you're on the senior team, playing basketball. So she didn't want to go because she didn't want to face the failure of not making the team, because she was the first off the bench, but on the bench in the junior team. So, I won't make the team. I won't make the team. And I said to her, I said, well, honey, I said, I get it if you don't want to go, but wouldn't you want to give it a try and see? Because you love the game. Is it worth giving it your best shot to see if you could make the team? And then always know that you gave it your best shot, even if you didn't. I didn't know if she'd do it or not. She didn't talk much about it, but she decided to. She worked her ass off. She worked and worked and worked and worked and practiced and practiced. And it was about physical fitness. It was never going to be about athletic ability, because she had mine. So that she was not going to be a star. But she made the team. And in her junior year, that's the second to last year, I think, she won an award at the school for the most inspirational athlete, because she made it without the skill and ability. So now fast forward, she's in university. And she's academically inclined, gets put into this case study competition. And her team that does this accounting, it doesn't sound very exciting to me. Hey, I'm not an accountant, but they do this case study competition. And she says they make it to the international finals 17 college universities represented from around the world, and they go to these finals. She does the case study. She calls me right after. She said, we nailed it. She doesn't know the result yet, but she just knew she nailed it. And what am I going to say? Oh, yeah, who? I said, oh, good. I'm not going to doubt her. So I said, well, what do you attribute that to? What do you attribute that to? Why do you believe you nailed it? And she said to me, it was preparation, repetition, and listening. Oh, that sounds quite profound from a 21-year-old.
Right.
I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, the repetition is in the stress of the moment. We had to do it over and over and over and over and over again, because when the bright lights were on, we needed to make it routine. It had to be habit. The willingness to learn, she said, I had to recognize my coach, that the professor knew more than I did, even though I didn't think much of him at the time. So I had to open my ears and listen. And then the work ethic around, I said, Katie, where did you learn that? She said, in high school basketball. Never, ever underestimate the value of what athletics brings to our children when they're in their youth. And this day, she plays recreational sports, and she will be a business leader. When did you learn it? From basketball in my sophomore year. That's why we do this stuff, Coach. That's why we do it.
That's a fantastic story. I definitely want to end on that. That's so good. That is such a great story to hear. Can you tell everybody where they can find you, your book, about your book as well, and how they could reach out to you?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Ignitemanagement.ca. Ignite Management, IGNITE management.ca. And our book is called Rise Up, Leadership Habits for Turbulent Times. Rise, and it's available on Amazon. It's Barnes & Noble. It's available right across around the world. It was just released 2 weeks ago to the public. We haven't hit it hard in the US yet, but we were actually #1 bestseller in our category in Canada last week. So we're pretty excited because we're just a small group. But I think these stories of turbulence, Coach, what we do as leaders in turbulence, people are needing this optimistic message. So Ignite Management, Rise Up, Leadership Habits for Turbulent Times. Love to hear from you. Love your feedback. And I loved this podcast. Man, I forgot I was on a podcast. I just thought I was in a great conversation and something that was just going deep. And that is the mark of a great interviewer, a great podcaster, Coach. So thank you. Honestly, I just feel so inspired after talking to you.
Thank you. It was enjoyable. I can't believe how much I learned, and the sponge in me. It's like I always love to hear not only somebody's story, and that's why it was so great to hear your daughter's story, because the things that you apply to the people you work with also has applied to your family. And that's ultimately so important, because they, sometimes when you have your own company, you forget that they want to learn those lessons too, right? And the fact that you're able to teach those in such a great way. Like, I mean, I can't tell you how many parents, and this goes to anything, not just sports, but if they can just take a moment to ask their child, hey, let's figure out what your best is. Give your best in everything you do. And you know what? It's all going to work out if you do those things. Thanks so much, Mike. I can't thank you enough. This was one of my favorite. I have to say, I've done a lot of these. This was one of my favorite Success for Life podcasts of all time. Okay. Wow. Of all time. I enjoyed the conversation. And those of you, sometimes people listen to the podcast and they think, oh, do you know that I have had people on that are my friends on the podcast. I've never met Mike a day in my life until today, but I feel like it's someone that I've known my whole entire life, just from talking with him. And that's what it's all about. Thanks so much, Mike, for being on.
I got to say one more thing. You gave me the opening. I have to say it. You got to let me. If you're a leader and a parent, your #1 job as a leader is with your kids. That's where it starts. That I don't give a rip where your successes are in business. If you haven't started in your house, then you're never going to be a leader in my books. It starts there, and it's the same principles. Thank you for hearing that. You're
Amen.
a beauty. You're a beauty. Amen. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Mike. For Successful Life podcast, I'm signing off. And thanks again for being on. Have a great day.
Take care. Thank you, sir.